Good morning. With the permission of HarperCollins Publishing, I am going to finish reading us our Piggle-Wiggle book that we started before we left. We were left off with Alan, who was taking the slow eater tiny bites. His mother began rattling pans and turning on burners, and pretty soon she handed him the drop cup filled with cream of tomato soup and the penny plate with 2 cracker crumbs on it. She said, "Now drink this soup in one gulp and put both those crumbs in your mouth at once." Alan did as he was told and leaned back and closed his eyes again. Then his mother handed him the thimble cup with milk and a tiny peanut butter sandwich on the dollar plate. She said, "Drink the milk in one swallow and put that whole sandwich in your mouth." Alan did and was surprised that he didn't feel quite so tired. He leaned back and he kept his eyes open. Then his mother handed him the doll cup filled with soup and the doll plate with some cottage cheese on it. "Drink the soup right down," she said, "and here is a large fork, and I want the cottage cheese eaten in 2 bites." Alan did as he was told, and he was told, but he was feeling strong. He could sit up without leaning back, and oddly enough, he was very hungry. His mother handed him the after-dinner coffee cup filled with milk and the saucer plate filled with a piece of gingerbread on it. Alan didn't have to be told how to eat or drink these. He took large bites and big swishing gulps, and the dishes were empty. His mother said, "Do you feel better? Have you had enough lunch?" Alan said, "I feel much better, Mother, but I'm still pretty hungry. May I please have a large bowl of soup and a large glass of milk?" "Of course, dear," said his mother. And she quickly filled a large bowl with soup and a large glass with milk. Alan ate every drop of the soup and drank every drop of the milk, and then jumped up from the table and said, "Oh, Mother, I bet Spotty's hungry. Shall I take him some soup?" "No, dear," said his mother. "I think Spotty would prefer an apple and some lumps of sugar." So they fed Spotty, and then Alan climbed on his back and rode proudly away, sitting up very straight and holding on to the reins with one hand. When he reached the corner by Patsy's house, his mother called him back. He turned Spotty around and steered him up to the gate, and his mother came out with a basket of slow-eater, tiny-biter taker dishes. "Would you mind returning these to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle?" she asked. "Not at all," said Alan graciously. "Just hand me the basket. I'll put it in the front of me, and I'll hold it with the hand. You see, Mother, I only use one hand now to steer." He carefully arranged the basket, kissed his mother, clucked to Spotty, and away they went, in a very slow walk towards Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's house. The Fighter Quarrels Cure. Joan Russell opened her blue eyes and saw that it was morning. She saw that her twin sister Annie was still asleep. Joan reached over and gave Annie a little pinch. "Wake up, Annie," she said, making her voice scary and urgent. "Wake up, quickly. There's a big black spider in the bed, and it's on your side." Anne awoke with a squeal, leapt out of bed, stubbed her toe on the box of paints that she left on the floor the night before, banged her funny bone on the door, and went screaming into her mother and father's room. "Mother, Daddy, there's a big black spider on my side of the bed." "Mother, Daddy!" Mrs. Russell sighed up and reached for her robe. She sighed and sat up. She said in a low, calm voice, "Annie, you didn't fall for that old trick again, did you?" Annie grabbed her mother's arm and jumped up and down, squealing, "But, Mother, Joan said so." "It's a big black spider." Mr. Russell turned over and yawned. He said, Stop jumping and squealing. Listen, if there is a big black spider in the bed, and it is highly unlikely then, why is Joan lying in there, staring at the children and waiting to be bitten and to be spanked?" he added in a loud voice. Anne stopped squealing and listened gravely to her father. But when he finished speaking, she said, "But, Joan, there was a spider, Daddy said there was." Her daddy said, "Last one dressed gets the littlest melon." And he jumped out of bed and chased Anne out of the room, roaring like a lion. Mr. Russell sang happily in his shower. Mrs. Russell frowned as she dressed from the children's room. She could hear, "That's my sock. Give it to me." "'Tis not. It's mine. Give it back." She heard the girl slap. "Mother, Anne's slapping me. That's my petticoat. You're putting on my petticoat. Give it to me." And there's the picture of the girls arguing. "'Tis not, it's mine." Slap. "That's mine." "No, that's mine." "'Tis not, 'tis not." Slap. Crash. Running steps. "Mother!" Mrs. Russell said to herself, "Quarreling, quarreling, from the time they get up to the time they go to bed. I do not believe that I can stand another day of it." She ran downstairs and began jamming oranges into the squeezer. Mr. Russell came listening into breakfast. He said mildly, "Oh, scrambled eggs again. I was hoping for sausage and buckwheat cakes." Mrs. Russell said, "We had sausages and buckwheat cakes yesterday morning." Mr. Russell said, "What about brook trout? Bill Smith has them nearly every morning." Mrs. Russell said crossly, "Perhaps that is why he looks like a trout and his wife looks like a great big halibut." Mr. Russell peered at her over the top of his morning paper. He said, "You know, sweetheart, I think the children's fighting and quarreling is making you irritable." Mrs. Russell said, "I think so too. In fact, it's driving me crazy. Just listen to them." From the upper hall they could hear it. "It's my turn to go down first, Joan." "'Tis not, it's my turn." "You were first yesterday, you know you were. But last night you traded your first turn for my pink crayon." "I did not." "You did too. Cheater, double cheater." In came the twins. Joan looked at her melon and then at Anne's. She said, "Anne's melon is the biggest. She always gets the biggest and the most of everything." Anne said, "You had the biggest yesterday. You're just a pig. You always want the most." Their daddy said, "As a matter of fact, ladies, I have the biggest melon because I was the first one dressed. Now hush." He glared at them. The twins sat meekly down to eat their breakfast. They had taken 2 bites, however, when Anne poked Joan and hissed, "I've got the most cereal, ha ha ha." Joan hissed back, "Yes, but I have 3 pieces of bacon and you only have 2. Anne looked, and sure enough, Joan did have 3 pieces of bacon. She grabbed one, but Joan snatched her wrist, and in the ensuing scuffle they managed to tip over Anne's milk and spill it all over the front of their nice blue pleated skirts. Their daddy was angry, their mother sponged them off, and they left for school, red-eyed and miserable, but still quarreling. As they rounded the corner, their mother could hear, "The big tablet is mine." "'Tis not, 'tis not," after Mr. Russell had left the office. Mrs. Russell picked up the phone and called her friends. Mrs. Quicktrick. She said, "Mrs. Quicktrick, this is Mrs. Russell, the twins' mother, and I want to know, is Jasper and Myrtle ever quarrel?" "Oh, my dear," said Mrs. Quicktrick, "all children quarrel. Why, yesterday Myrtle hit Jasper with his big doll, and the eye came out, and then Jasper hit Myrtle with the little hammer out of his nice new toolbox, and the head came off and the hammer, and I just told them that I wouldn't have them breaking up their toys that way." Mrs. Russell said, "But the children weren't they hurt?" Mrs. Quicktrick said, "Why, I didn't notice. I was so angry at them for breaking their lovely toys, and the doll hospital won't be able to put Myrtle's doll's eyes back for 2 weeks. And you know how hard it is to get hammers these days." Mrs. Russell said, "Well, thank you anyways." Mrs. Quicktrick hung up. She poured herself a cup of coffee, and while she drank it, she thought about her little fighter quarrelers. Then she had an idea. She would call Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle and ask her what to do. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle would know if anyone would. She called Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle and said, "Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, I am Mrs. Russell, the mother of Anne and Joan." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, oh, yes, the twins, such darling girls and so pretty." Mrs. Russell said, "But they quarrel so." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, "They begin fighting the moment they open their eyes in the morning, and they don't stop until they fall asleep from exhaustion. It is dreadful, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. You should hear them." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, I know, that's my sock. No, it's mine. That's my box. No, it's mine. 'Tis not, 'tis not. You have the most. You're a pig," Mrs. Russell said. "Why, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, you must have heard them." "I was hoping they didn't quarrel when they were down at your house." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, no. I haven't heard Anne and Joan, but I have heard hundreds of children. You see, fight or quarrelages is a common children's disease, and it's very contagious, but easy to cure." "Easy to cure?" "Oh, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle." "How?" asked Mrs. Russell. "Well," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, "in the first place, fighting and quarreling are merely habits. One morning a child awakens and feels a cross, so instead of smiling at his little brother and saying good morning, he glares at his little brother and shouts, 'You've got on my shirt.' The little brother says, 'I have not,' because he hasn't. The cross child says, 'You have to, you have to.' And the quarreling has began." The next morning both children have the fight or quarrel, and they wake up and begin shouting rudely at each other. It soon becomes a habit, and they forget how to be courteous. Now, Mrs. Russell, I believe that if fight or quarrelists could hear themselves as others hear them and see themselves, and others see them, they would soon realize how unpleasant they were and be cured. In order to do this with Anne and Joan, you and Mr. Russell will have to pretend to be Anne and Joan first. However, you must write down every single fighting thing that children say. Begin with the morning and keep a careful record of the whole day. Say nothing to the twins, but tomorrow you and Mr. Russell repeat their quarrels. I do not believe that it will be necessary to slap and pinch, but be sure to be loud and noisy. Don't laugh and don't let the children know that this is a game. Look quarrelsome, as well as acting quarrelsome. One day is usually sufficient. Mrs. Russell said every morning Joan tells Anne that there's a big black spider on the bed. Anne sighed, and Anne comes screaming into our room. Should Mr. Russell and I do that? My, said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. That is the way Billy and Tommy Peters used to start their day, only Billy told Tommy it was a cobra. Well, cobra or black spider, you and Mr. Russell do the same. Goodbye and good luck. After saying goodbye to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, Mrs. Russell sat down and wrote down every word of Anne and Joan's morning quarrel that she could remember. After school, she purposely gave one of them a bigger apple. Then she gave the other one, and then followed them around and wrote down the quarreling. She stayed in their room while they undressed for bed and took notes. Fortunately, the children were very productive and fought about the amount of toothpaste on their toothbrushes, whose turn it was for the shower, whose pillow was the softest, the amount of room they had in the bed, who had the most covers, whose turn it was to turn off the light, who had the biggest feet, whose mouth opened the widest, who had the most teeth, everything. My, they were naughty and disagreeable. When she had finished writing it all down, Mrs. Russell handed a copy to Mr. Russell and told him about Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. He thought it was a wonderful idea and studied his part carefully. The next morning Joan opened her blue eyes and was just reaching out to pinch Anne when she heard commotion in Mother and Daddy's room. And suddenly the door flew open, and in came Mrs. Russell, clutching her bathrobe and squealing. Anne, Joan, quick, there's a big black spider in our bed, and it's on my side, Joan said calmly. How do you know there's one? Did you see it? Anne woke up out of habit. She leapt out of bed and ran to the door squealing. Her mother squealed louder, and Anne was surprised, asked her what the trouble was. Her mother began pounding on the bed and yelling, There's a big black spider in our bed, on my side, Daddy said so. He saw it. Anne said, But Mother, if there's a spider, why is Daddy in there? Her mother paid no attention to her, but continued to squeal. Daddy said there was. I'm scared. Eee! Joan said, We'd better go and look, Anne. So they solemnly marched into their mother and Daddy's room. Mr. Russell was lying in bed, gazing at the ceiling. Anne threw back the covers, and Joan peered into the bed, but all they could see were Daddy's feet, and the toes wriggling. Anne said sternly, Why did you scare Mother that way, Daddy? Mr. Russell said, Was she scared? And jumped out of bed and ran into the bathroom, shouting at the top of his voice, Ha ha, my first turn for the shower. At that, Mrs. Russell came flying in from the twins' room and began pounding on the bathroom door, yelling, It is not your turn. It's mine. You traded me for your first turn yesterday for a new golf ball. Mrs. Russell laughed rudely and called out, Too bad for you, I've got the door locked. Mrs. Russell kicked at the door and shouted, Cheater, cheater, cheater. Anne and Joan looked at each other. And there's Anne and Joan looking at their parents in the bedroom. Their eyes were round with amazement. Anne whispered, Let's get dressed, said Joan. Let's hurry. They tiptoed to the room, closing the door carefully behind them. While they dressed, they could hear their mother and father quarreling. When Mr. Russell came out of the shower, Mrs. Russell said, You used my towel. That's my towel. Mr. Russell said, 'Tis not. It's mine. Mrs. Russell said, 'Tis not. It's mine. Mrs. Russell said, That's my shirt. You've got on my new t-shirt. Mr. Russell said, Well, you've got on my golf sweater. Mr. Russell said, Take off my new shirt. Mrs. Russell began to bawl. She sobbed, You wore my golf sweater, and you promised me that I could wear your shirt. You're a pig. Mrs. Russell said, All right, baby, wear the old shirt. At breakfast, Mr. Russell took a little ruler out of his pocket and measured the grapefruit. And then he took the biggest. Mother snatched it away from him and spilled coffee on the new shirt. Mother served the scrambled eggs and gave herself a large heaping plate and Daddy a small serving. Daddy looked at both plates and said, "Pig." "Speaking of pigs," said Mrs. Russell, "it's my turn for the car." "'Tis not," said Mr. Russell. "It's my turn. You had the car last week." Mrs. Russell said, "I only drove up to the drugstore and back last week. You went clear out to the golf club." Mr. Russell said, in a very disagreeable way, "It makes no difference to me how far you drove. Have you had your turn, madam?" Mrs. Russell began to bawl. "I think you're mean," she wailed. "Isn't it my turn, girls?" She turned to the twins. The girls looked at their mother, but they didn't answer. Instead, they asked to be excused, put on their coats, and hurried off to school. At dinner that night, Daddy took the chops up to the bathroom and weighed them on the scale, and then took the two biggest. Mother took the biggest baked potato, but she was sorted the string beans out one by one, so that everyone got an equal share. But they were ice cold. The twins cleared the table, and Anne carried in the pumpkin pie. Now, pumpkin pie was the twins' very favorite dessert, and so Anne was very careful to walk slowly and put the pie down gently in front of Daddy. But it was a wasted effort, for Mom reached over and grabbed the pie, saying, "I'll serve that." "Oh, no, you won't," said Daddy, jerking the pie back. "Will too," said Mother, reaching for the pie. But Daddy jerked it off the table, held it over his head, and Mother grabbed his wrist, and the pie went splat all over the rug. The twins began to cry. They said, "Mommy, Daddy, please stop quarreling. We just can't stand it anymore. It's dreadful." Mother said, "Why, we thought you were enjoying fighting." Joan said, "We hate quarreling. We're so unhappy," Anne said. "Fighting is terrible. It makes us miserable." Mrs. Russell took Joan on her lap. Mr. Russell took Anne on his lap and said, "To tell the truth, girls, we don't like quarreling either. It is just a habit we caught from you." "Why, we must have been quarreling all day," the twins said. You have. Daddy said, "I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll all join hands and solemnly pledge that there shall be no more quarreling in this house. Then we'll all walk up to Finley's drugstore and seal the pledge with ice cream. Does everyone agree?" "We all agree," they shouted. So they joined hands and said, "I solemnly pledge I will not quarrel or fight in this house ever again." They ended up walking to Mr. Finley's drugstore and had ice cream sodas. And even though Anne saw Mr. Finley put 3 scoops of ice cream in Joan's soda and only 2 in hers, and even though Joan saw Mr. Finley put 2 scoops of strawberry in Anne's soda and only 1 in hers, they neither of them said a word. The fighter quarrelitis was cured. The end. So tomorrow we will start a new story. I hope you enjoyed the rest of our book, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle.